evening of December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, a period of just 10 days, George Washington's brave and rugged patriots won a series of battles at Trenton, Assunpink Creek, and Princeton, New Jersey. During this time, Washington, the Continental Army's commander, morphed from a conventional officer who had served faithfully for the British Army in the French and Indian War to a resourceful, innovative, shrewd, covert, audacious, and enduring American general who cobbled together and held together an unlikely variety of independent fighting men. The Patriots and Washington conceived of and believed in a new nation unlike any nation the world had ever known, a republic that stood on liberty, self-government, personal responsibility, and the right of every individual to pursue all he or she aspired to be. In a remarkable moment in time and in our American history, these three battles, Trenton, Assunpink Creek, and Princeton, were won by the faith and boldness of patriots who were not expected to win anything, much less defeat the largest and finest army in the world. These are known as the 10 crucial days of the American Revolution, and they would change the momentum of the war, the spirit of Washington's soldiers, and the soul of a new nation. Like the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Assunpink Creek was won with Washington's boldness and creativity, working through faith and through his men who trusted their commander and believed in the ideals and the future of a new country. 2 days earlier, on the evening of December 25th, 1776, in an audacious move, Washington led his men across the Delaware River and into Trenton, New Jersey, and surprised and defeated British and Hessian soldiers in a swift battle that restored the confidence and the spirits of his men and of a nation. Washington, who expected a quick and aggressive British counterattack, quickly moved his men and nearly 1,000 prisoners back over the Delaware River to his Pennsylvania camp that same day. Now, on the south banks of the Delaware, Washington and his war council convened. As early as December 12, 1776, Washington had ordered Colonel John Cadwalader to obtain any information of British motions or intentions. "Spare no pains or expense," Washington commanded. Cadwalader's efforts bore fruit in the form of a detailed, handwritten map of British positions around Princeton, New Jersey, just 11 miles north of Trenton. This intel, provided by a very intelligent young gentleman who had just returned from the Princeton area, revealed detailed information on British works, cannon, and force dispositions, as well as valuable information on the road networks around Princeton. But first, Washington had to get to Princeton, and before he did that, he had another problem. The enlistments of his men would expire on December 31st. Fearing the war would be lost if the majority of his army dissolved, Washington offered his men $10 to stay. With no takers, Washington followed the offer with an eloquent and impassioned speech. "My brave fellows, you have done all I ask you to do, and more that can be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably can never do under any other circumstances." First, one man stepped forward, then another, and soon about half the men agreed to stay, making possible another victory just 3 days later at Princeton. Meanwhile, General William Howe, the British Commander-in-Chief of North America, was still fuming over the British defeat at Trenton, so much so that he canceled Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis's scheduled leave to Britain for the winter and ordered him to Princeton immediately. By January 1st, 1777, Cornwallis and 8,000 British and Hessian troops converged on Princeton, where Cornwallis was convinced by British General James Grant, who was a key tactical advisor to General Howe, and by Carl Von Donop, the commander of the British garrisons in Trenton, Bulington, and Bordentown along the Delaware, to march to Trenton and to retake it. Knowing their plans, Washington determined to meet them. On December 29th, Washington once again moved his army back across the Delaware, and this time set up camp just south and within sight of Trenton along the Assunpink Creek. On January 2nd, Cornwallis left part of his force in Princeton under the command of Charles Mawhood and took 5,500 of his men and set off down the 11-mile road to Trenton. Fortunately, the day before, the extra $10 Washington promised each of his men if he stayed to fight arrived from Congress, as did a series of resolves, including one that gave Washington powers similar to those of a military dictator. Emboldened by the confidence Congress had in him and the authority they had given him, Washington determined to stand and fight the British at Trenton. To prepare for battle, he ordered his men to build a 3-mile-long line of earthworks down to the south end of the stream, until one of his aides, a Joseph Reed, who was also a lawyer and was later credited with being the first to expose the treason of Benedict Arnold, pointed out to the general that there were fords upstream that the British could effectively cross, driving in the Continental Army's right flank. If that happened, Washington would be unable to escape across the Delaware again because his boats were several miles upstream. Realizing he would be trapped, Washington told his officers that he planned to move the army and that their current position was temporary. As Washington was considering his predicament and his options, Cornwallis and his army had begun their march from Princeton to Trenton. With 28 cannon, he marched in 3 columns until he reached Maidenhead, where he detached Colonel Alexander Leslie and 1,500 men who were to remain there until morning. Knowing the British were on their way, Washington upon his arrival at Trenton, had already sent troops under the command of Matthias Alexis Rocher de Vermoy to place an outer defensive line between Trenton and Princeton, with the goal of delaying the British advance. But Vermoy had returned to Trenton drunk. Colonel Edward Hand took over his command. When the British were close enough, Hand's riflemen would fire, taking cover in the woods, ditches, bends in the road, and trees, and each time the British would line up in conventional battle lines. Each time they did, the Americans would fall back and fire again from different cover. Hand took a position along the south bank of the Assunpink Creek, where he deployed his men to attack from trees, where they were also well protected from British view. American riflemen were able to fire upon the British at almost point-blank range, confusing the British into thinking that they were up against the entire American army, and causing them to form battle lines, bringing up their cannons. Thinking they were now ready for proper battle, they waited and waited, and then searched for American soldiers who had already withdrawn to a new position. It was about 3 in the afternoon when the British reached Stockton Hollow, a ravine about half a mile from Trenton. There, the Americans were busy forming another line of defense. Washington had to hold off the British until nightfall, when darkness would prevent them from attacking the American defenses on the south side of the Assunpink Creek. Reconnoitered and wiser, the British, with artillery in place, attacked Hand's new position. Slowly falling backwards toward Trenton, Hand's men fired from behind the houses. As they came to the Assunpink, Hessian soldiers charged the Americans with fixed bayonets, causing chaos for Washington's men. Seeing the chaos, Washington rode through the crowd of soldiers, ordering Hand's rear guard to pull back and regroup under the cover of American artillery. British cannon and musket fire ensued. The British moved across the bridge at Assunpink in solid columns, aimed at the American camp. The Americans fired together, causing the British to fall back, but only for a moment. The British charged the bridge again, but were thwarted, this time by cannon fire. The British charged the bridge one last time, and this time the Americans hit them with canister shot, raking the British lines. One American soldier said, "The bridge looked red as blood, with their killed and wounded and their red coats." After the 3 assaults, the British had lost 365 men, while the Americans lost only 100. By now, it was almost dark. Cornwallis and some of his officers didn't want to wait until morning to fight, but believing that the Continentals were already worn out and defeated, and reasoning that it would be better to wait instead of sending his troops to attack in the dark, the British Lieutenant General held off. "We've got the old fox now," said Cornwallis as he watched Washington's men across the Assunpink build fires for the evening. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." Meanwhile, Washington called another council of war. Knowing that there was a second and more obscure road to Princeton, Washington and his war council agreed to abandon Cornwallis and his men at Trenton and head for Princeton and fight the British there. By 2 a.m., the American soldiers were on their way to Princeton, leaving behind 500 men and 2 cannons under the command of Henry Knox, with instructions to occasionally fire shells into Trenton to keep the British on edge, to keep the fires burning, and to make noise with shovels and picks to make the British think that the Americans were digging in for battle. By morning, these 500 men and their equipment had also left Trenton, heading for Princeton. And as the sun rose at Trenton and the British prepared to attack, they realized all too late that they had no one to fight.